Imagine this. You're huddled inside a drafty cave, shivering under a mammoth skin that smells a little too much like mammoth. The wind howls outside, and your stomach growls inside. You haven't eaten in 3 days. The snow never stops falling, and all the berries and nuts vanished months ago. The only thing that looks remotely edible? The guy sitting next to you. And suddenly, prehistoric dinner gets awkward. Yes, tonight we're drifting into the icy grip of the prehistoric starvation winters, when food was so scarce that some humans, desperate to survive, turned to cannibalism. It's grim, it's fascinating, and it's actually the reason you and I are here today, because our ancestors were absolute survival maniacs. Now, don't worry. This isn't a horror story meant to jolt you awake at 2 a.m. It's a sleepy exploration of how ordinary people, tougher than leather boots, and hungrier than your fridge, at midnight survived the most brutal winters on Earth. We'll talk about ancient climate shifts, caves turned into survival bunkers, and the bleakest family dinners of all time. But we'll do it in a way that feels cozy, safe, and yes, even a little funny. So, get comfortable, pull that blanket up, adjust your pillow, and maybe thank your heater for existing, because as dark as this story gets, it's also deeply human. And as you drift off to sleep, you'll know one thing for sure. Compared to the Ice Age, your thermostat at 68 degrees is pure luxury. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the coldest day you've ever felt. Maybe you stepped outside one morning in February, your breath turning to frost in the air, your ears instantly stinging, your hands fumbling for your gloves. Now multiply that cold by 10. Then stretch it out for months. Then take away your house, your hot chocolate, your electric heater, and your Netflix queue, and replace all of that with a cave, a pile of damp animal skins, and the faint hope that tomorrow might not be colder than today. That's winter in prehistory. The world back then wasn't sprinkled with cozy little cottages puffing out wood smoke. There were no Christmas markets, no steaming bowls of soup, no mittens hand-knitted by your grandmother. The winter landscape of prehistoric Europe, Asia, or North America was a frozen desert of ice and wind, punctuated by the occasional herd of shaggy beasts that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of drunk mammoth enthusiasts. The horizon was endless whiteness, the kind of whiteness that makes you feel like you're falling into it. Snow piled so high, it could bury trees. Rivers didn't just freeze, they turned into solid glass highways that cracked and moaned as if the earth itself were groaning under the weight of the ice. Imagine the soundscape of this world. No cars rushing by, no airplanes overhead, no gentle hum of city life, just the wind. Endless, howling wind. It whipped across frozen plains and rattled the entrances to caves, like an uninvited guest, determined to crash the party. Inside, the cave smelled like smoke, sweat, damp fur, and sometimes fear. The fire flickered low because wood was scarce, and every spark was guarded like treasure. And then there was hunger. Hunger that gnawed at your belly constantly. The kind of hunger that turned your thoughts into grocery lists of things that didn't exist yet. You'd dream of bread, but bread hadn't been invented. You'd crave pasta, but wheat cultivation was still a good 800,000 years away. You'd fantasize about a cheeseburger, but cows weren't domesticated, cheese didn't exist, and hamburgers were still several McDonald's logos in the future. Instead, your menu consisted of whatever roots could be dug up through the frozen soil, marrow sucked from old bones, and if you were lucky, a sliver of dried meat left over from autumn. The darkness of winter added another layer of misery, with no clocks, no calendars, and only the stars to guide you. Night and day blurred together into a kind of grey twilight. The sun rose late, hung weakly in the sky, and disappeared before you'd finished gnawing on that last frozen root. For prehistoric families, the night wasn't something cozy. It was long, cold, and terrifying. Darkness was full of predators, wolves, cave lions, and hyenas that prowled just beyond the firelight, waiting for someone to wander too far. But the most relentless predator was the cold itself. It seeped into every crack, every gap in a fur blanket, every drafty corner of the cave. It stiffened fingers and slowed movements, made even small tasks like scraping a hide or sharpening a stone tool feel monumental. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find your hair frozen stiff from your own breath. Imagine trying to cuddle for warmth when everyone smells like wet mammoth wool. Even romance in the Ice Age was a logistical nightmare. And yet, despite all of this, there was beauty. Step outside into the frozen dawn, and the world shimmered. Ice crystals clung to every branch, glittering in the faint sunlight. Snowfields stretched endlessly, dazzling and silent. Herds of reindeer moved across the horizon like living shadows, their breath steaming in the air. The night sky, free of city lights, burned with more stars than we can imagine today. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smudge. It was a glowing river that seemed close enough to touch. There's also a strange comfort in imagining those prehistoric winters, because as brutal as they were, people endured them. They sat huddled together, telling stories around the fire, probably about heroes who found magical food caches, or gods who controlled the snow. They laughed when they could. They teased each other, maybe with jokes about who smelled the worst after weeks without bathing. They endured not just with desperation, but with humor and imagination, the same things that carry us through long winters today. So picture it now. The icy wind outside, the flickering fire inside, the crackle of bones burning for fuel because wood is scarce. Picture families pressed together, bundled in animal skins, their stomachs empty but their spirits stubborn. This was winter in prehistory, a season that was not just cold, but bone-deep, world-shaping cold. And surviving it required more than luck. It required adaptation, resilience, and sometimes choices that would haunt them forever. Now, let's drift deeper into the why of all this misery. Because winter in prehistory wasn't just bad luck. It was written into the earth itself. Planet Earth has always had a flair for drama, and nowhere is that clearer than in the Ice Age cycles. The climate didn't just decide to be cold, it decided to play a long, cruel game of freeze and thaw that lasted hundreds of thousands of years. Picture the Earth as a giant spinning top. Most of the time, it wobbles along steadily. But every so often, the angle shifts, the wobble grows bigger, and sunlight hits the planet differently. That small change ripples out into enormous consequences. Summers get weaker, winters grow longer, ice sheets spread, and suddenly, you've got half of Europe buried under a layer of ice thick enough to make modern-day freezers look like toys. Scientists call these patterns Milankovitch cycles, but to prehistoric people, they just called it life. Or maybe they didn't call it anything at all. They just endured. These cycles meant that every so often, the climate would tip from being tough but manageable into full-blown extinction-level hard mode. Forests that once provided nuts and fruits disappeared under glaciers. Grasslands that fed mammoths and reindeer shriveled into tundra, where only scraggly mosses and lichens could survive. Rivers dried up or froze over. Lakes vanished. The buffet of nature shut down its service, and the only thing left on the menu was hunger. Food vanished not because people forgot how to find it, but because it literally wasn't there. Imagine, you're a hunter. You step outside with your trusty spear, dreaming of roast reindeer, but the herds have migrated hundreds of miles south. You're left chasing the faint tracks of animals you'll never catch, burning more calories than you'll ever gain. Or imagine you're a gatherer, poking around the frozen soil with a stick, trying to find roots. The ground is so hard, you might as well be trying to dig into concrete. Even if you find something, it's shriveled, bitter, and barely worth the effort. The climate shifts also meant unpredictable weather. Some winters dragged on endlessly, snow falling even in months that used to be warm. Other times, sudden thaws would turn snow into floods, wiping out shelters and drowning lowland camps. Imagine storing your precious dried meat in a pit, only to find it waterlogged and rotting after an unexpected warm spell. Nature wasn't just stingy, it was downright cruel. Animals struggled too. Many species went extinct, not because of overhunting, but because the climate yanked away their food supply. Giant deer with antlers as wide as a car? Gone. Woolly rhinoceroses that once thundered across the steppe? Gone. Even mammoths, those icons of the Ice Age, eventually dwindled, and when the animals disappeared, humans had nothing to hunt. This is why people turned to desperate measures: scraping marrow from bones left behind by wolves, boiling hides into a kind of rubbery soup, or in the most extreme cases, turning to cannibalism. Think about how exhausting it must have been. Survival wasn't just about finding food, it was about constantly moving, constantly adapting, constantly chasing the hope that somewhere, just over the next ridge, there might be a little more. Groups wandered endlessly across icy landscapes, dragging children, carrying fire embers in bundles of moss so they didn't have to start from scratch. The climate shifts kept them from ever feeling secure. If one year was good, the next might be catastrophic. Feast never lasted long before famine returned, and yet, these cycles shaped us. They forged resilience, creativity, and cooperation. They forced humans to invent new tools, new hunting strategies, new ways of storing food. They also forced us to bond more closely, because when food vanished, the only real safety came from sticking together. You didn't want to be the loner in the Ice Age. Lone wolves didn't survive. You needed the pack. So when you lie here tonight in your warm bed, remember this: the simple fact that you can roll over, adjust your blanket, and fall asleep without wondering if your last piece of dried root will get you through the night is a miracle. A miracle paid for by ancestors who endured the brutal cycles of Earth's climate, who watched food vanish and still found a way to keep going. Hunger is one of those things you think you understand until you meet it the way our prehistoric ancestors did. Modern hunger is the kind where you check the fridge, see nothing you like, sigh dramatically, and order takeout. Prehistoric hunger, on the other hand, was a gnawing, unrelenting companion. It wasn't about skipping lunch. It was about your body slowly dismantling itself for fuel, one fat cell, one muscle fiber at a time. Imagine waking up in a cave on a winter morning. The air is so cold that your breath has frozen into little crystals on your animal skin blanket. You're surrounded by family, all of them wrapped tightly together like a pile of mismatched laundry. Your stomach growls loudly enough to echo against the cave walls, and the sound is almost embarrassing. Not because anyone else is doing better, everyone's stomach is staging the same protest chorus, but because you know the answer is nothing. Nothing to eat. The diet of starvation wasn't glamorous. Forget feasts of mammoth meat and berries. That was the summer dream. Winter was about scraps. Roots were a staple, but calling them food is generous. They were frozen, fibrous, bitter, and often barely digestible. Digging them up meant hacking into frozen ground with stone tools that broke as often as they worked. Once unearthed, the roots had to be chewed for what felt like hours, yielding only a faint hint of starch and the distinct aftertaste of dirt. You can picture someone around the fire, holding up a root and muttering, "Gourmet dining, 900,000 BC edition." Bone marrow was another prize. When hunters were too weak to bring down large game, or when rival predators had already claimed the best parts of a carcass, people turned to bones. They cracked them open with rocks, licking out the marrow like it was liquid gold. And in a way, it was. Marrow is rich in fat and calories, and in a world where energy meant survival, it was like striking oil. Families would sit around gnawing on old bones, hoping for that satisfying glisten of fat inside. It's not exactly a Michelin-starred meal, but if you're starving, it feels like winning the lottery. Of course, not all scraps were glamorous marrow and roots. There were other delicacies, like chewing on strips of dried hide. Picture trying to eat your shoes, and you're close. People boiled leather scraps in water, softening them into something vaguely chewable. It had all the flavor of boiled cardboard, but with the added bonus of keeping you alive. In moments of true desperation, people gnawed on antlers, or even their own belts. If you've ever been tempted to eat the remote while waiting for dinner, know that your ancestors would have approved. Hunger did something else. It invaded your thoughts. Modern studies show that when people are starving, up to 80% of their mental energy is consumed by food fantasies. Prehistoric people were no different. Around those weak, smoky fires, Conversations probably revolved endlessly around food. Someone would sigh and say, "Remember, the summer berries?" And everyone else would groan in agreement. Someone else would describe in detail the fat dripping off a roasted haunch of reindeer, and suddenly the entire cave would feel like they were watching the Food Network. And yet, there was humor even here. Humans, stubbornly, have always laughed at misery. Imagine the banter. "Well, this root is extra crunchy tonight. I'd give it 1 star on Yelp." Or, "Careful with that marrow bone, cousin. You'll spoil yourself and never want to go back to bark stew." Even in starvation, laughter was medicine. A way to turn the unbearable into something a little lighter. The tragedy of daily hunger was its relentlessness. There was no break, no day off, no promise of tomorrow's feast. It wasn't about one hard day, it was about weeks and months of scraping by. Children cried with empty bellies. Elders grew gaunt and frail. Parents did what they could, sometimes pretending they weren't hungry so children could have a little more. That sacrifice is as old as humanity. And through it all, the smell of food, even just the faint scent of fat crackling in a fire, was enough to make hearts race. Hunger turned every scrap into treasure. When you lay down tonight in a full belly, remember this: the gnawing emptiness your ancestors endured on scraps of roots and marrow shaped the human spirit. They survived not just on food, but on stubbornness, jokes, and the unbreakable will to keep chewing, no matter how terrible the taste. Hunger is quiet at first. It starts with a grumble, a little weakness in the knees, maybe a sharper temper than usual. But when food is missing for days or weeks, hunger becomes something else entirely. It rewires the body and mind, turning you into a creature entirely devoted to finding food. Our prehistoric ancestors knew these signs intimately, not because they studied biology, but because they lived it in their bones. The first sign was weakness. Muscles that once swung spears, with ease became heavy and slow. Imagine trying to throw a stone at a rabbit and missing by several feet because your arm feels like it's made of lead. Walking itself became exhausting. Journeys that once took an hour stretched into entire afternoons. People dragged their feet through snow, breath coming in shallow gasps. Children stopped running and playing. Even laughter grew quieter because it took too much energy. Exhaustion followed close behind. The body, in its desperate effort to conserve energy, made every task feel monumental. Getting up from the cave floor, a struggle. Carrying firewood, a nightmare. Even chewing those tough roots became an ordeal. Hunger turned every part of life into slow motion, like living underwater. And yet, tasks had to be done. Fire needed tending, children needed comfort, shelters needed repairing. People did what they could, often collapsing afterward, trembling with fatigue. But starvation also produced something strange: creativity. Desperation has always been the mother of invention. When traditional foods vanished, humans became experimental chefs of the bleakest kind. They tested new plants, sometimes discovering edibles, other times learning painful lessons about poison. They boiled pine needles into teas, scraped moss from rocks, and even tried eating earth, rich in minerals. Archaeologists have found evidence of clay consumption in prehistoric sites, suggesting people literally ate dirt to fill their stomachs. It wasn't delicious, but it was something. Animal parts once considered inedible became dinner. Hooves were boiled into gelatinous soups. Skins were roasted. Even candle-like lumps of fat were eaten, smoky and greasy, but rich in calories. Bones weren't just cracked for marrow. They were boiled again and again until the last trace of nutrition leached into water, creating thin, greasy broths. In moments of dark humor, someone probably slurped such a broth and said, tastes like mammoth, if you close your eyes. Starvation also warped the senses. The smell of cooking became intoxicating. Even the faintest whiff of roasted meat or burned fat could send a starving family into a frenzy of hope. Dreams were filled with food, lavish banquets that vanished upon waking, leaving only the ache of emptiness behind. Stories of mythical lands with endless feasts may have been born in these long winters, tales whispered to children to soothe them to sleep. The mind itself changed under starvation. People grew irritable, then quiet, then strangely detached. Concentration wavered. Decisions became foggy. And yet, in the fog, flashes of brilliance appeared. Starving groups invented new traps, new ways of storing food, new hunting strategies. They had to. Survival demanded ingenuity. Weakness and exhaustion pressed them down, but creativity lifted them, if only a little. The cruelest sign of starvation was the toll on the body. Faces hollowed, eyes sunk, ribs jutted out. Children's growth slowed, elders wasted away. In the silence of winter nights, coughing echoed in caves, lungs weakened by malnutrition, vulnerable to infection. The body began feeding on itself, stripping fat, then muscle. Yet through all of this, people endured. And sometimes, endurance required crossing lines. Starvation forced choices unthinkable in times of plenty. It whispered, "Survive at any cost." And in the bleakest winters, that whisper grew louder, pushing people toward desperate measures that would scar memory, but also ensure survival. There's a point in every winter, at least in prehistory, when the food supply crossed a terrible threshold. In the early weeks, there might still be dried meat, maybe a few roots tucked away in pits, or some berries strung up on cords. But after enough weeks of scraping and nibbling, even those ran out. That's when humans turned to the recipes of desperation meals that make today's worst college student cuisine look like fine dining. Take bark soup, for example. The name sounds kind of rustic, maybe even comforting, as if you'd order it at a hip cafe downtown. In reality, it was soup made of tree bark, not the crunchy outer bark, but the inner layer called cambium, which, believe it or not, does contain a little starch. People scraped it off with stone tools, boiled it in water, and slurped it down like broth. The flavor? Imagine chewing a piece of cardboard soaked in rainwater, with just a hint of bitterness. Not exactly grandma's chicken noodle. Still, in starvation, it was food. Or at least it tricked the stomach into thinking something edible had passed through. Then there was boiled leather. Leather was supposed to be a belt or a strap, not dinner. But when hunger clawed deep enough, people boiled old hide in water for hours, until it softened into a gummy, gelatinous substance. It probably smelled like wet shoes and tasted worse, but it filled the belly. Imagine sitting around the fire, slurping strips of boiled moccasin, joking that at least it was low carb. Archaeologists have found remnants of boiled leather in survival sites, proof that humans have always pushed the definition of food when circumstances demanded. And then there was bone broth, except not the trendy bone broth you see in health stores today, with herbs and salt and Instagram-worthy packaging. This was bone broth made from the same bones that had already been cracked for marrow, boiled again and again until the last whisper of fat and protein seeped into the water. It wasn't hearty. It was thin, greasy, and smoky. The prehistoric equivalent of tea, brewed from the same bag 10 times. Still, families clutched their bowls and sipped, savoring the illusion of nourishment. Other experiments were less successful. People tried grass, but grass contains cellulose that humans can't digest. The result was stomach aches on top of hunger. Some chewed moss and lichen, hoping for sustenance, only to gag at the bitterness. Others resorted to clay, swallowing mouthfuls of soil rich in minerals, but poor in calories. It filled the belly, but at a cruel cost. The body remained as hungry as ever. There's a grim kind of comedy in imagining these meals. Picture a prehistoric family holding a feast of boiled shoe leather and bark broth, trying to cheer each other up. Someone raises a cup of bark soup in a toast and says, "Ah, vintage birch, 900,000 years old." Everyone laughs weakly, because what else can you do? Laughter was as important as calories, even when calories were impossible to find. These meals of desperation weren't just about taste. They were about survival psychology. Eating something, anything, gave people the will to keep going. A belly that wasn't totally empty could trick the mind into believing tomorrow might be better. Even chewing leather or sipping bark tea gave the body a sense of ritual. Food preparation, however meager, created the illusion of control in a world dominated by chaos. And sometimes, These terrible meals bought just enough time. A few extra days, a little more energy, maybe just enough for the weather to break, for a herd of reindeer to wander close, for rescue to arrive in the form of spring. That's what bark soup and boiled leather really were. Bridges between despair and possibility. Disgusting lifelines stretched across the chasm of starvation. It's easy to laugh at the idea of people chewing their shoes. But then again, people in sieges, as late as the 19th century, did the same thing. History is littered with accounts of humans, faced with hunger, turning to hide, bark, and worse. Desperation erases the boundaries of cuisine. And in prehistory, when survival was the only goal, every terrible dish was a quiet triumph. If bark soup and boiled leather were the appetizer course of starvation, then cannibalism was the unspoken main dish. But unlike chewing roots or boiling bones, this was not just about nutrition. It was about taboos, ancient beliefs, fears, and whispers that haunted the edges of survival. Cannibalism is one of those topics that makes people squirm, even today. It's the ultimate line, the last step, the thing you're not supposed to do, under any circumstances. And yet, in prehistory, evidence tells us that it happened. Bones have been found with cut marks, marks not made by predators, but by stone tools, the kind used to scrape meat from carcasses. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls cracked open, not for ritual, but for the marrow-rich brain inside. The scientific evidence is clear, but the psychological evidence, the way people must have thought about it, is murkier and fascinating. For early humans, eating another person wasn't just a matter of hunger. It was spiritual, terrifying, and sometimes even sacred. Many groups likely believed that to eat human flesh was to absorb something more than calories. Maybe it was power, maybe it was spirit, maybe it was a curse. Around the flickering firelight, whispers would have spread. Those who eat the dead risk angering the spirits. Or worse, they risked becoming the very thing they consumed. And yet, when starvation pressed hard enough, taboos cracked. Fear gave way to survival. Imagine a family sitting in a cave, staring at the body of someone who hadn't survived the cold. The silence is heavy. The hunger is unbearable. Someone finally mutters what no one else dares to say. And in that moment, the line between taboo and necessity blurs. But it's not as if cannibalism was taken lightly. Archaeologists suggest that even when practiced, it was surrounded by ritual. Bodies might have been treated with ceremony, words spoken, gestures made, as if to appease unseen forces. In some cases, skulls were decorated or carefully placed, as though the act of eating required compensation, a balance of respect and violation. Cannibalism also carried a strange fascination. Humans are storytellers, and the most forbidden acts often become the juiciest stories. Perhaps tales were told around the fire of tribes that went too far, of people cursed with endless hunger because they ate their own. Perhaps children were warned, behave, or the starving ones will come for you. These stories might have both acknowledged the reality of cannibalism and reinforced the taboo against it. Fear became a boundary, a way of keeping people from leaping to that final resort until there was no other choice. Even today, echoes of those beliefs remain. Many cultures have myths of ghouls, vampires, or monsters that eat human flesh. Some of those myths probably sprouted from prehistoric winters, when cannibalism wasn't myth at all, but grim reality. The taboo lingered because it had to. If cannibalism were normal, human societies would fracture under mistrust. Who would dare sleep if hunger made neighbors into predators? And yet, fascination persisted. People whispered about it, feared it, joked about it nervously, the way we laugh at scary stories today. Cannibalism was both unthinkable and imaginable, both forbidden and inevitable. That tension shaped early human belief systems, adding layers of meaning to survival. So, as grim as it is, cannibalism wasn't just about hunger. It was about morality, community, and fear of the unseen. To cross that line was to enter dangerous territory, not only physically, but spiritually. And yet, when the cold deepened, when the bark soup was gone, and the boiled leather had been chewed to shreds, the line sometimes had to be crossed. The taboo survived because the act was never comfortable. It was always shrouded in fear and ritual, whispered about but rarely admitted. It was the darkest shadow cast by the flickering firelight of prehistory, a shadow that still lingers in our myths, our stories, and our unease today. There's a point where hunger stops being just uncomfortable and starts becoming unbearable, when every hollow ache in the stomach is like a drumbeat, reminding you that the body cannot last much longer. For prehistoric people, trapped in endless winters, that point was not abstract. It was immediate, physical, and terrifying. And sometimes, when all other food was gone, they crossed a line that humans have drawn and redrawn throughout history. Cannibalism. Now, it's one thing to speculate about it in a story. It's another thing entirely to find the evidence written in bone. Archaeologists have uncovered that evidence again and again, and each discovery whispers the same truth. In the depths of starvation, some humans ate other humans. Not because they wanted to, not because they relished it, but because survival leaves little room for rules. When scientists dig up prehistoric bones, they don't just look at the shape of the skull or the thickness of the femur. They study the marks. Stone tools leave telltale patterns. A predator's teeth might leave deep punctures or ragged scratches, but a human hand guided by a sharp flake of flint leaves something different. Clean, deliberate cuts, sometimes in parallel lines. These are butchery marks, the kind you'd find on animal bones after a meal. Except in these cases, the bones belong to people. One of the most famous pieces of evidence comes from Gough's Cave in England, where human bones dating back around 15,000 years were discovered. They weren't just scattered randomly. They bore clear signs of butchery. Long bones had been split open to extract marrow. Skulls were carefully broken to access the brains. The cuts were methodical, the same kinds made when preparing animals for food. It was survival reduced to its starkest form. Someone had not just crossed the line, they had marched across it with tools in hand. Other sites echo the same story. In Spain, at Grandalina, researchers found the remains of early humans from about 800,000 years ago, and those bones also carried the unmistakable scars of human butchery. Children's bones, adults' bones, all treated like prey animals. It shocks us now, but to the people of that time, trapped in starvation, the taboo could be pushed aside. The need to eat overwhelmed the fear of crossing into the forbidden. What's haunting about these discoveries is the humanity of it all. These weren't anonymous skeletons. They were family members, neighbors, friends. In small prehistoric groups, everyone knew everyone. To eat the dead meant to make a decision that was both pragmatic and unthinkable. It's one thing to imagine roasting a stranger, it's another to imagine cutting into the person you huddled beside the night before. Archaeological evidence doesn't tell us how people felt, but we can guess. It must have been done with trembling hands, whispered apologies, or even rituals meant to soften the horror. Cannibalism wasn't limited to Europe. Evidence has been found in caves across the world. In France, Germany, and Croatia, bones tell the same story. In North America, some ancient Puebloan sites show signs of butchery on human remains during times of drought. In South America, skeletons from Andean societies carry the same marks, though in some cases, ritual was as important as survival. Again and again, the pattern repeats. When food ran out, humans turned to the only resource left themselves. And yet, we shouldn't imagine this was routine. If it had been, it wouldn't leave such a lasting mark in myth and memory. The archaeological evidence shows it was rare, sporadic, a choice made in the worst of times. The very fact that we recoil even today proves how deeply the taboo has always run. But when archaeologists hold those bones, with their deliberate cuts and cracked marrow chambers, the truth cannot be denied. The line was crossed. There's a strange comfort in this grim reality, because it shows that survival, as brutal as it was, mattered. Our ancestors endured, even when it meant doing the unthinkable. The cum boat of cum, is Evidence is not just about cannibalism, it's about resilience, about the human refusal to simply lie down in the snow and die quietly. It's about people finding a way, any way, to keep the fire burning one more night. If you wander through the silent chambers of certain caves today, you might see neat walkways, glass cases, and tour guides pointing out stalactites. But thousands of years ago, those caves were not tourist attractions. They were homes, shelters, and sometimes the stage for desperate survival. And beneath their cool stone floors, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of what really happened when hunger pushed humans to the brink. Take Gough's Cave in Somerset, England. At first glance, it seems like any other cave with winding passages and dripping walls. But when excavations began, archaeologists unearthed something unsettling: human bones. At first, that wasn't unusual. Many caves contain burials. But these weren't burials. The bones had cut marks. Skulls were broken open with precision. Long bones were splintered to reach the marrow inside. Even more unsettling, some skulls had been shaped into cups, as though used for drinking. Were they ritual vessels? Were they just practical bowls? No one knows for sure. But the evidence leaves little doubt. Cannibalism was practiced here. In Spain, at the Grandolina site in Atapuerca, the story goes back even further. About 800,000 years ago, early humans lived there, leaving behind not only stone tools, but also butchered human remains. The bones of children and adults alike showed clear signs of being scraped, cut, and cracked. To the people of Grandolina, human flesh was not just taboo-breaking food, it may even have been part of their normal survival strategies. Some scientists argue it wasn't only desperation, but also opportunism. Why waste valuable meat, even if it came from your own kind? Another haunting site is Krapina in Croatia, where Neanderthal bones dating back over 40,000 years were discovered. Many of those bones bear cut marks from stone tools. Some were smashed to reach the marrow. The evidence suggests the Neanderthals there, like their Homo sapiens cousins, resorted to cannibalism during desperate times. It's chilling to imagine these small groups, huddled in their shelters, finally turning to one another when no other food remained. And it wasn't only Europe. In North America, at a site called Cowboy Wash in Colorado, archaeologists found ancestral Puebloan remains with cut marks from stone tools. Bones were cracked open, organs removed. There was even evidence of cooking. The date: around 1150 AD, during a time of severe drought. The landscape had dried, crops had failed, and people faced famine. Survival demanded crossing the same line their distant ancestors had crossed in Ice Age Europe. Each of these caves of bones tells the same dark story, echoing across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. When food vanished, when winters were merciless, or droughts unrelenting, humans sometimes consumed their own, and the bones remain as mute witnesses to those choices. It's tempting to imagine these sites as places of horror, but in truth, they were places of endurance. The caves sheltered families, gave them firelight against the cold, and in the end, preserved the evidence of their struggles for us to uncover. When scientists kneel in the dirt and lift a femur marked with cuts, they aren't just holding a bone. They're holding the story of survival, of choices made in the cold silence of prehistory. And there's something strangely soothing in that thought, because it reminds us that we are here, alive and comfortable, precisely because our ancestors endured those winters, those droughts, those famines. The caves of bones are not just about death. They're about the will to keep living, even when the only food left was each other. The bones tell us what happened. They carry the marks of knives, the cracks of deliberate blows, the signatures of cooking fires. But bones do not tell us what people felt. To reach that, we have to use imagination, empathy, and a dose of honesty. Because the emotional toll of cannibalism, especially survival cannibalism, must have been immense. And yet, it was borne by people who did not have the luxury of therapy, confessionals, or even enough words to articulate what they had done. Imagine being part of a small group huddled in a cave, hunger pressing in like a constant drumbeat. You've already eaten everything else, the last root, the last strip of hide, even the faint broth boiled from bones. And then someone dies. Maybe it's an elder who slipped away quietly. Maybe it's a child whose thin body could no longer resist the cold. Or maybe it's someone who fell ill and never woke up. The grief is sharp, immediate. But almost as soon as grief arrives, another thought creeps in, unwanted but undeniable. Food. It must have felt like betrayal just to think it. To look at the familiar face, still in death, and imagine the body not as family but as sustenance. The mind probably rebelled, fought against the idea, perhaps whispered prayers to spirits or gods to forgive the thought. But hunger doesn't negotiate. It gnaws and screams until the unthinkable becomes possible. And when that line was finally crossed, the emotional cost was not erased. Picture it, a group of gaunt, hollow-eyed people around a fire, the smell of cooking meat drifting into the air. A smell so intoxicating that stomachs twisted with longing, even as hearts twisted with horror. Someone takes the first bite. The silence is unbearable. Does anyone speak? Or do they all stare at the flames, pretending not to see what's happening, even as they eat? For the ones who did it, the taste must have been strange. Not because human flesh is dramatically different from other meat, but because of the knowledge behind it. They weren't eating deer or mammoth. They were eating someone whose laughter they remembered, someone whose voice they could still hear in memory. The mind must have made that bite taste like ash, even as the body welcomed the calories. And afterward, what then? Did they bury the bones with ceremony, whisper apologies, try to pretend it hadn't happened? Did children grow up with the memory of that night carved into their minds, carrying a silent shame that echoed through generations? Or did they learn to tuck it away, to treat it as an act of survival, no more monstrous than chewing bark or drinking melted snow? We'll never know exactly, but we can guess that the emotional toll lingered. In the way people told stories later, in the way they whispered warnings about famine and the taboos against eating human flesh. Perhaps those feelings became the myths of monsters who devoured their kin, or curses that followed those who ate the dead. The bones give us the evidence, but the myths give us the emotion. And together, they paint a picture of survival stained with sorrow. But perhaps there was also relief mixed in. Relief that the children would live another day. Relief that the fire would keep burning, because someone had the energy to gather more wood. Relief that survival, even at this cost, was still possible. The human heart is complicated. It can carry grief, shame, relief, and determination all at once. And that, more than anything, is the emotional toll of survival cannibalism. A burden carried because there was no other choice, and because life, however fragile, is stubborn. Now, it might seem impossible to laugh about such grim realities, but humans have always used humor to survive. When the nights were long, the caves drafty, and the meals less than appetizing, laughter was the only seasoning available. Even in the shadow of desperation, there must have been jokes, banter, and sarcastic remarks about the situation, because without them, the silence of hunger would have been unbearable. Picture a family crouched around a fire, sipping the thinnest bone broth imaginable. Someone lifts their bowl, looks into the watery liquid, and says, tastes just like my hopes and dreams. The others chuckle, even though their stomachs hurt, because it's true. Another night, when the only meal is strips of boiled hide, one of the children chews slowly and says, "This is the best chew I've ever had," and laughter ripples through the group. Humor was the spark that made starvation a little less cruel. Even cannibalism, as terrifying as it was, probably drew nervous jokes. Humans joke about what frightens them most that hasn't changed. Imagine someone muttering, "Careful how you look at me. I'm starting to feel like the main course." Or, "Don't sleep too far from the fire, cousin. You're looking tender." The laughter would be uneasy, but it would still be laughter. Because if you can laugh at it, even for a moment, you take back a little power from the fear. And then there were the awkward family dinners. Imagine a cave, echoing with chewing, but no one daring to mention what they were eating. Silence, heavy as stone. Then a child pipes up, innocently, "Is this uncle?" A pause, and then nervous laughter. Someone tries to spin it into humor. No, no, Uncle would be much tougher. This is definitely Auntie. It's grim, it's awkward, but it's also survival humor, the kind that makes horror just a little more bearable. Dark humor thrived in those caves because the alternative was despair. When people chewed on bark, they joked about being tree eaters. When they cracked bones, they joked about wolves being jealous. When they stared at snow and thought about eating it, someone probably sighed and said, "Ah yes, dessert." These weren't stand-up routines, but small sparks of absurdity that turned the unbearable into something human. The truth is, humor is one of humanity's oldest tools. It stitched groups together when resources were scarce. It let people bond even when food was gone. And in those caves, humor was as necessary as fire. Without it, the emotional toll might have crushed them entirely. With it, even the darkest meals had just a trace of light. So when you think of prehistoric people huddled in caves, don't just imagine misery. Imagine them laughing quietly at awkward jokes, teasing each other about chewing on leather, pretending bark soup was a delicacy. Imagine humor echoing in the cave alongside the crackle of fire. Because even in the darkest winters, humans found a way to laugh. And maybe, just maybe, that laughter helped them survive just as much as food did. To modern minds, the idea of eating another human being is shocking, even revolting. But when we try to understand why our prehistoric ancestors did it, we need to slip into their world, not ours. In their world, choices weren't weighed in the glow of electric light, with pantries and supermarkets down the road. Choices were made in frozen caves, where every breath felt like glass in the lungs, where children whimpered through the night, with bellies bloated from hunger, and where waking up meant facing another day of emptiness. To them, survival logic was brutally simple. Live or die. Survival strips away the layers of culture and morality that usually shape human behavior. When there's enough food, rules are easy to follow. You can afford to be noble, generous, or squeamish. But when famine sinks its claws in, morality bends under pressure. Prehistoric people understood that, perhaps better than anyone. Their lives were a tightrope walk, and starvation made that rope thinner and thinner until only the strongest balance remained. Survival logic is rooted in biology. The human body can last only so long without nourishment. 3 days without water, a few weeks without food, and the body begins to collapse in on itself. Muscles weaken, organs fail, the brain grows foggy. For a prehistoric family, starvation wasn't some distant fear. It was an everyday predator, as real as wolves and lions, and harder to fight. If the only way to push back that predator was to eat what remained of a dead relative, logic whispered, "Do it, or none of you will see the spring." And though we recoil at the thought, there's an undeniable practicality in it. A human body contains thousands of calories. Fat, muscle, marrow, all the energy that one person's body has stored across a lifetime suddenly becomes a resource for those still living. Survival logic turns the unthinkable into a grim form of recycling. In a world without waste, where nothing was left unused, even death could be transformed into fuel for life. But survival logic was never just cold arithmetic. It was also a negotiation with fear, grief, and taboo. People didn't want to cross that line. They hesitated, they resisted, they whispered to the spirits. But logic pressed harder. If you don't, your children will die tonight. If you don't, the fire will go out, because no one will have the strength to fetch wood. If you don't, the story of your family ends here, swallowed by the snow. Survival logic didn't shout. It whispered, insistent and relentless. Even in modern times, when famines or disasters have trapped people, the same logic appears. Think of shipwreck survivors stranded at sea, or explorers trapped in the Arctic. Again and again, the same choice is made. Not because people are monsters, but because logic overrides horror when the alternative is certain death. Prehistoric people lived in conditions far harsher than any modern disaster. To them, desperate choices weren't a shocking aberration. They were the grim arithmetic of existence. We can even imagine the conversations. Not spoken in polished language, but in guttural sounds, gestures, and perhaps tears. A parent pointing to the body of someone lost to cold, then pointing to their child, then miming hunger. Others nodding reluctantly. Silent agreements sealed by desperation. There must have been shame, but there was also determination. And once the decision was made, survival logic demanded they carry it out quickly, before hesitation could return. The logic extended beyond food. Survival demanded hard choices about who traveled, who rested, who risked their lives to hunt, who was left behind. Resources had to be allocated like a harsh accountant keeping books in firelight. The old may have received less so the young could eat. The strong were given more because they could gather wood, defend the group, or chase prey. These were not cruel calculations, they were survival logic. Decisions made to preserve the group at any cost. When you look at it that way, cannibalism in desperate times wasn't insanity. It wasn't depravity. It was simply another form of that logic. And as terrible as it worked. People survived. And because they survived, we are here. Survival logic has always been the quiet, ruthless voice that whispers beneath the grand story of humanity. And though we may not face the same choices today, understanding why they did reminds us of the cost of life in a world where every day was a battle against cold, hunger, and despair. The bones prove what happened. The cut marks, the cracked skulls, the scraped marrow. They tell us that humans sometimes ate humans when winter grew too long. But bones don't preserve stories. For those, we look to culture, to the strange echoes that traveled down through time, whispered from generation to generation until they became myths, legends, and fairy tales. And when you start listening carefully, you realize just how many of our old stories are haunted by cannibalism. Think of the monsters that lurk in folklore. The ogre, who fattens children to eat them. The witch in the forest, who lures the hungry with a gingerbread house. The vampire, who drains life from the living. These aren't random inventions of imagination. They're cultural echoes of something very real, the memory of humans devouring humans. In a world where survival cannibalism happened, myths served as warnings and reminders. Don't stray too far. Don't trust the stranger. Don't forget the horror of hunger. Many cultures carry tales of man-eating spirits. In Native American traditions, the Wendigo is a creature born of hunger and cannibalism. Tall, emaciated, with a heart frozen by greed, the Wendigo prowls winter forests, devouring humans and never satisfied. To some, it was a literal monster. To others, it was metaphor, a story to remind people of the dangers of starvation, of how desperation can twist a person into something unrecognizable. The Wendigo was survival cannibalism turned into myth, cautionary and terrifying. In European folklore, cannibals appear again and again. The Brothers Grimm collected stories like Hansel and Gretel, where the villain isn't just cruel but hungry, planning to eat children. Jack and the Beanstalk features a giant whose catchphrase, "Fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman," is basically prehistoric hunger, turned into rhyme. Even fairy tales told to children in cozy cottages carried faint shadows of the caves where ancestors once whispered about the dead being eaten. These echoes weren't just for fright, they preserved taboos. By turning cannibalism into the act of witches, ogres, or cursed spirits, societies reinforced the idea that it was monstrous, unthinkable, something only desperate or evil beings did. The stories kept the memory alive but pushed it into the realm of horror, keeping ordinary people from considering it in times of plenty. It was both acknowledgement and denial, memory and warning. Even in ritual, echoes survive. Some cultures practice ceremonial cannibalism, not out of hunger but out of belief. Eating a piece of the dead might honor them, absorb their strength, or keep their spirit close. These rituals, though far from starvation, may also echo those ancient winters when flesh kept families alive. Over time, the act shifted from survival to symbolism, but the root memory lingered. It's fascinating how persistent the echo is. Modern horror films still draw on the same fear. Zombies are essentially cannibalism myths with the volume turned up. The fear of being devoured by your own kind. The terror of hunger without end. Hannibal Lecter, ghouls, vampires, all are modern Wendigos, retellings of the same ancient dread. Even as we live in an age of abundance, where food is just a delivery app away, the memory of hunger remains in our cultural DNA, resurfacing in stories that make our skin crawl. But there's humor in folklore too. Stories of foolish cannibals who bumble their way into traps, giants who get outsmarted by children, witches tricked into ovens. These tales allowed people not only to fear cannibalism, but to laugh at it, to take some of the sting away. Humor, once again, softened horror, turning the memory of desperate meals into bedtime tales where the good triumphed and the hungry villain fell. Cannibalism myths remind us of a truth that bones alone cannot say, that people remembered, and remembering shaped culture. The taboo was preserved not only in silence, but in story, ensuring that even as the practice sometimes returned in desperate winters, it was never comfortable, never normal. And in a strange way, those myths keep us connected to our ancestors. When you hear of an ogre, or a vampire, or a witch in the woods, you're hearing the faint, distorted echo of a cave where hunger once forced someone to cross the line. When we talk about the prehistoric winters and the grim choices people sometimes made, it's easy to focus only on the horror. But hidden inside that darkness was something else. Resilience. Those who survived weren't just lucky. They were forged by conditions that demanded every ounce of strength, both physical and mental. The cliché of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger may be tired in modern life, when it's usually about forgetting your phone charger, but back then, it was brutally literal. What didn't kill you truly did shape you into something tougher, sharper, and more likely to pass your genes forward. In those times, the strongest didn't always mean the biggest muscles or the heaviest clubs. Strength was measured in adaptability. The people who survived weren't necessarily the ones who could wrestle a reindeer, but the ones who could think quickly, who could solve problems, who could make something out of nothing. Someone who figured out how to dig roots from frozen soil or remembered which mosses were safe could save an entire group. That kind of intelligence was strength, and it became encoded into the survival story of humanity. The grim reality also shaped emotional resilience. Imagine the constant grief of losing family members to cold or hunger. Imagine having to live with the memory of choices made in desperation. For most people, such trauma would crush the spirit. But somehow, prehistoric people carried it, endured it, and kept moving. They didn't have therapists or mindfulness podcasts. What they had was community small groups where stories were shared, laughter softened grief, and determination was passed on like fire from one ember to the next. There's also a strange kind of genetic truth to this. The people who endured these winters, who withstood famine and fear, passed their traits on. That's why we, thousands of years later, carry in our bones and minds the legacy of resilience. You can see it in small ways even now. Humans recover from wars, famines, disasters. We rebuild cities flattened by earthquakes. We laugh in the face of tragedy. We invent things when everything seems lost. That's not just modern ingenuity. It's prehistoric resilience echoing forward. Of course, not every kind of strength was noble. Sometimes it was the ruthless who survived, the ones willing to take more food, to push others aside, to cross lines faster. But even that shaped us. Our social instincts grew sharper because groups that tolerated only selfishness didn't last. Cooperation became strength too. The groups that survived were often the ones who could balance the ruthless edge with compassion, making sure children and elders were protected. In that tension, humanity learned how to be both fierce and empathetic. Think of it this way. Every ancestor who managed to crawl out of those winters alive was a master of resilience. They were stubborn, inventive, and maybe just a little bit mean when they had to be. And that combination is written into us. That's why even now, when someone drops their sandwich on the floor, they'll still eat it. That's survival logic. That's prehistoric resilience, still whispering that wasting food is dangerous. or why so many people panic buy toilet paper during a crisis. It's a faint echo of the instinct to hoard supplies before famine hits. Silly in the modern context, but very serious in the prehistoric one. Resilience also meant redefining normal. For us, comfort is heating, full meals, and maybe Wi-Fi that doesn't buffer. For them, comfort was one more day alive, one more fire burning, one more meal, however small, shared with the group. That redefinition hardened them, and it shaped us. We may not need to crack marrow bones with stone tools anymore, but the drive to endure, to keep going, is still at the heart of being human. The strongest survive not just in muscle or cleverness, but in spirit. And because they did, you are here now, in a warm bed, listening to this story, with the luxury of closing your eyes and drifting into sleep, instead of staring at the dark, wondering if you'll eat tomorrow. Their resilience was the inheritance they gave us, forged in the worst winters imaginable, carried forward like fire in the dark. For all the bleakness of calm, winter, prehistoric life wasn't a constant dirge of misery. There were rhythms, seasons, and moments of relief. Summer brought a kind of abundance that must have felt miraculous after months of scraping by. If winter was despair, summer was reprieve. The cycle of feast and famine was the heartbeat of prehistoric life. When the ice melted and rivers began to flow again, the world transformed. Green spread across the land, animals returned in herds, and plants burst into life. For people who had been gnawing on roots and marrow, the sight of berries alone must have felt like a gift from the gods. Imagine children running to bushes heavy with fruit, staining their hands and mouths red and purple, laughing with joy as they ate more than their bellies could hold. The same people who once sat in silence, chewing bark soup, suddenly feasted on fresh food, their bodies remembering what fullness felt like. Hunting became easier. 2. Animals that had migrated returned to graze on lush grass. Reindeer, bison, even mammoths followed the green wave north. Hunters could once again fill their stomachs with meat, drying strips of it in the sun, smoking it for storage, turning fat into fuel. Bones were no longer just emergency snacks, they were luxuries. A roasted leg of deer was no longer unthinkable but expected. After famine, the feast must have felt like heaven. But the abundance of summer was never carefree. It was preparation. Everyone knew winter would return, as sure as the stars rising. So summer became a frenzy of storing, preserving, hoarding. Berries were dried, roots were dug and hidden, fat was rendered and stored. Every animal hunted wasn't just tonight's meal. It was a step towards surviving the winter to come. Feast was always shadowed by famine. Like sunlight edged with the promise of storm, the cycle created a rhythm in the body. 2. People gained weight in summer, storing fat as natural insurance against the lean months. Bellies grew, cheeks filled out, energy returned, and when winter came, that fat was slowly burned away, leaving gaunt faces and thin frames until the cycle began again. It was biology married to the environment, a natural dance of feast and famine. Psychologically, the relief of summer must have been intoxicating. After months of hunger, the simple act of chewing fresh food must have been pure bliss. Around fires, laughter returned. Stories grew more elaborate. Courtship flourished, because with food came energy, and with energy came love songs, even if those songs were just rhythmic grunts, with meaning lost to us now. Babies conceived in summer were timed to arrive when food was more plentiful. Another way, survival and abundance were tied together. But summer wasn't perfect. It brought its own dangers. Spoiled food, swarming insects, rival groups, competing for resources. And always, the clock was ticking. People could never simply bask in plenty, they had to think ahead, to remember the taste of hunger that would come again with the snow. The summer feast was not indulgence for its own sake, but an investment. Each berry dried, each hide tanned, each pile of wood stacked against the cave wall, a hedge against winter's cruelty. Still, it must have felt glorious compared to famine. Imagine sitting under the sun after a winter of endless grey, your belly full of fresh meat, your children tumbling in grass instead of shivering in furs. Imagine the relief of hearing the river rush with snowmelt, knowing water was abundant again. Imagine laughter rising from groups who, only months before, whispered through gnawing hunger. The contrast itself gave life meaning. Without famine, the feast would not have been so sweet. This cycle, harsh as it was, shaped humanity. It taught planning, foresight, and the art of storage. It taught resilience by forcing people to enjoy abundance without forgetting scarcity. It etched into our psychology the instinct to stock up, to save for a rainy day, or in their case, a snowy season. Even today, we echo that rhythm. We feast during holidays, we diet after. We store pantries full of food, even when the grocery store is right down the road. We carry the memory of those ancient cycles in our bones. Life between starvations was not paradise, but it was enough to remind people why survival mattered. The sweetness of berries, the taste of fresh meat, the warmth of the sun, these were the moments that balanced the horror of winter. Feast and famine together created the rhythm of prehistoric life, the pulse that carried humanity forward through the long ages. When the sun slipped behind the horizon and the cold pressed in like a physical weight, prehistoric people had one defense that was more powerful than their stone tools and more enduring than their animal skin cloaks. They had fire. A circle of flames in the dark was not just warmth and light. It was safety, it was community, and it was imagination set free. And on those long nights of hunger and cold, firelight was the stage where stories were told. The fire itself was mesmerizing. Imagine staring into flames after a day of exhausting labor, your stomach empty, your body weak. The way the flames twisted, flickered, and danced must have felt almost magical. Sparks shot upward like tiny stars, reminding people that the night sky outside was filled with real ones. The crackle of burning wood became a kind of music, soft and constant, like the background hum of existence. And in that glow, faces appeared out of the shadows, each one familiar, each one precious, gathered close against the cold. It was here, in these circles, that stories were born. People told of hunts, of narrow escapes from predators, of strange dreams that seemed too vivid to ignore. They invented heroes who could do the impossible, who never starved, who always found game when others found nothing. They invented spirits who controlled the wind and snow, or who hid food as punishment for human arrogance. The stories weren't just entertainment. They were explanations, comfort, and sometimes instruction disguised in myth. A parent might tell children the story of a hunter who disobeyed the rules, chased game too far, and froze to death. A grim tale, yes, but one wrapped in meaning. Don't stray too far from the group. Another story might be about a woman who followed the tracks of a rabbit and discovered a hidden spring that never froze. A story of luck, but also a reminder. Pay attention to the smallest signs. There must also have been funny stories. Even in the bleakest winters, humans have always laughed. Imagine someone teasing their friend with an exaggerated tale, and then I saw the biggest deer ever, as tall as the cave roof. But when I threw my spear, oh no, I had been aiming at a tree. The group bursts into laughter. The absurdity, a balm against hunger. Firelight made space for humor, for play, for that strange human ability to turn fear into laughter. And then there were the stories of ancestors. Perhaps they spoke of the people who came before, the ones whose bones lay buried in the hills. Maybe they believed those ancestors were watching from the stars, or from the shadows beyond the firelight. Stories connected the living with the dead, reminding everyone that they were part of something bigger. Survival wasn't just about today, it was about carrying the thread of existence forward, one generation at a time. There's evidence in the archaeological record that some of these stories may have taken physical form. Cave paintings, etched and painted in flickering firelight, were more than art. They were memory made visible, a way of retelling stories without words. The glowing light would have made the animals on the walls seem to move, dancing in the shadows. Perhaps a hunter told a tale of the bison chase, while pointing at the painted figures, the children watching in awe as if the walls themselves were alive. the comfort of stories was profound. In a world of uncertainty, where famine and predators threatened at every turn, stories created meaning. They explained why the cold came, why the food disappeared, why the stars moved in the sky. They gave people a sense of control, even if only in imagination, and they gave hope. Because in stories, heroes always found food, always lit the fire, always survived the storm. Listening to those tales, families could believe that maybe, just maybe, they would too. It's not hard to see the line that stretches from those firelit circles to us now. Tonight, as you listen to this story, you are part of the same tradition. The glow may come from a screen instead of a fire, but the purpose is the same: to comfort, to entertain, to carry meaning through the dark hours. The stories that once helped people survive the Ice Age still live in us. They became myths, religions, histories, and bedtime tales. The firelight is different, but the human need for story is eternal. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, where one bad winter could wipe out an entire family, the most important resource wasn't food or fire. It was knowledge. Knowledge had to be passed on like an inheritance, not written in books or carved into tablets, but spoken, demonstrated, and practiced until it became instinct. Children weren't just entertained by stories around the fire. They were students in a school where every lesson was life or death. From the moment they could walk, children were absorbing survival skills. They learned by watching their parents dig roots, skin animals, or weave hides into clothing. A toddler clumsily mimicked striking flintstones together, fascinated by the sparks. A child followed older siblings to gather berries, learning which colors meant nourishment and which meant poison. Mistakes were not tolerated kindly by nature. A wrong berry could mean illness. A misstep near a frozen river could mean drowning. Children had to learn quickly, and they did. Survival sharpened their curiosity into focus. But it wasn't just practical skills. Kids also learned the unwritten rules of the group: when to share, when to stay silent, how to show respect to elders, how to avoid drawing the attention of predators. They learned that wandering too far from the cave could mean never coming back. They learned how to read weather signs in the sky, how to tell by the silence of birds that danger was near, how to listen to the crackle of ice, and know when to retreat. Every detail mattered, and every detail had to be remembered. Play was education, too. When children threw sticks like spears or stalked each other in games of chase, they were practicing for the hunts they would one day join. When they pretended to cook imaginary meals of mud and leaves, they were rehearsing the roles of providers. Even laughter had its lessons. Humor helped them understand how to cope with fear and hardship, how to bond with others, how to carry their share of emotional weight in the group. Adults knew that without careful teaching, children would not survive the next winter. So they wrapped lessons inside stories. A tale about a child who wandered off and never returned became a warning disguised as drama. A myth about a trickster who tried to hoard food but starved anyway became a lesson in sharing. Stories ensured that even before children could remember details, they remembered feelings: fear of wandering, pride in sharing, admiration for cleverness. The importance of teaching is written in our very biology. Humans have unusually long childhoods compared to other animals. A deer can walk within hours of birth. A human baby, by contrast, is utterly helpless for years. Why? Because the amount of knowledge required to survive was vast, and it took time to pass it on. The long childhood wasn't a weakness. It was an evolutionary strategy. More years of learning meant more survival skills, and more survival skills meant better odds of enduring famine, predators, and cold. Imagine a child listening carefully, as an elder demonstrated how to chip flint into a blade. The elder's hands were steady from years of practice, while the child's were clumsy, the stone breaking wrong more often than right. But patience was key. Every broken stone was a lesson, every spark, a promise that one day the child would be skilled enough to make tools for the group. That kind of practice took months, even years, but it had to be done. A dull blade could mean a failed hunt, or a wound that would not heal. The same was true for fire. Fire wasn't guaranteed. A family might carry embers in moss from one camp to the next, but sometimes the flames died. Then, the ability to spark a new fire meant the difference between life and freezing. Children learned to cradle flint and tinder, to breathe gently on the first wisp of smoke, to treat fire with reverence. If a child could master fire starting, they weren't just clever, they were a future lifeline. By the time they were teenagers, children had become full participants in the cycle of survival. They knew which routes to dig, how to follow tracks in the snow, how to scrape hides, how to laugh when the food was terrible. They had been taught not just the skills, but the mindset, to endure, to adapt, to cooperate. And in teaching those things, prehistoric adults ensured that their culture, their knowledge, their very lives would stretch across generations. We sometimes forget how fragile survival knowledge was back then. There were no bookshelves to lean on, no internet to consult. If a skilled hunter died before teaching the next generation, that knowledge could vanish forever. If a group forgot how to preserve food or repair shelters, the next winter might wipe them out. That's why education wasn't optional, it was survival itself. Every child was a library. Every child carried within them the collected wisdom of their people. And when you look at children today, you can still see the echoes of that ancient urgency. Their endless questions, their play that mimics adult life, their fascination with stories. All of it is survival learning, honed across millennia. The stakes aren't as high now. Forgetting to tie your shoes won't get you eaten by a cave lion, but the instincts are the same. We are the descendants of children who listened well, who learned carefully, who remembered the lessons that kept them alive. Winter made everything sharper. Not just the cold that cut into skin or the hunger that gnawed at bones, but also the way people looked at each other. When survival balanced on the edge of a blade, the question of how to treat outsiders, neighbors, wanderers, strangers at the mouth of the cave was not a matter of courtesy. It was a matter of life and death. Imagine you're sitting around a weak fire with your family. The last of the marrow soup has been shared. Your children are curled together, like small birds trying to keep warm, and the silence of hunger hums in the background. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside. A figure appears at the entrance, wrapped in furs, gaunt with starvation. What do you do? On the one hand, compassion whispers, share what you have. They are human, like you. Tomorrow, it could be you knocking on someone else's cave. On the other hand, logic roars. If you feed them, your children may not see spring. This was the brutal calculation prehistoric people faced again and again, and it shaped how communities thought about outsiders. Neighbors, the groups who lived just over the ridge or along the next valley, were both allies and threats. In good years, they might trade with you, exchanging hides for flint or berries for tools. But in bad winters, alliances could crumble into suspicion. If your family was starving, did you want to share food with people who might take more than they gave? Every meeting between groups carried tension, a mix of wary greetings and watchful eyes. A friendly wave could turn into a spear thrust if hunger grew too fierce. Still, cooperation sometimes saved lives. Groups that shared knowledge where animals had been seen, which roots were still edible, which streams still flowed, were stronger than those who shut themselves off completely. The logic of survival wasn't only about hoarding, it was about balancing risk and reward. Strangers could be mouths to feed, but they could also be extra hands to hunt, to gather, to keep the fire going through the night. And so, groups often made uneasy truces, testing strangers carefully before deciding whether to embrace or reject them. But there's little doubt that fear dominated many of these encounters. Strangers were unpredictable. They might carry disease. They might arrive not alone, but with hidden companions ready to raid. And in the darkest winters, they might not even be alive for long. Archaeologists have found evidence in some caves suggesting that outsiders who arrived during times of starvation were not always welcomed as neighbors. Sometimes they were consumed. Survival logic again, cold, merciless, but undeniable. The emotional side of this was complicated. People weren't robots. They felt pity, sorrow, fear, even guilt. But emotions were filtered through hunger. A kind face at the door was still a competitor for calories. Compassion was a luxury, and luxuries were expensive when every breath might be your last. Yet even in this harshness, humanity found ways to preserve bonds. Marriages between groups created alliances that meant survival for children. Rituals and shared myths gave strangers common ground. Even in scarcity, people sometimes looked at outsiders not as threats but as potential kin. That fragile openness is part of why humans spread across the globe. If every group had closed its cave door forever, we'd still be huddled in a few valleys. It was risk, but it was also opportunity. In the end, neighbors and strangers in prehistory occupied the same ambiguous role they often do today. They were both feared and needed. They were the ones who might take your last scrap of food, or the ones who might save you with theirs. And the way people balanced that tension shaped not only their survival, but the deep instincts we still carry about trust, suspicion, and community. For tens of thousands of years, humanity lived by the rhythms of feast and famine. Winters brought hunger, summers brought relief, and survival was a seasonal gamble. But then, slowly and unevenly, something extraordinary happened. People discovered a way to change the rules of the game. Agriculture. The idea seems obvious now. Plant seeds, wait, and eat the results. But in a world where people had survived for millennia by moving, by chasing herds and gathering wild foods, the shift was monumental. It wasn't just a new skill. It was a turning point in human history, a revolution that rewrote the relationship between people and the land. At first, it must have seemed almost magical. You drop a few seeds into the dirt, and weeks later, food sprouts from the earth. Not bark soup or marrow scraps, but actual food grains, roots, vegetables that could be stored and eaten long after they were harvested. It was as if the earth itself had finally agreed to cooperate, offering something more predictable than the cruel lottery of hunting and gathering. But agriculture didn't arrive overnight. It was gradual, discovered and rediscovered in different parts of the world. People noticed that seeds, spilled near camps, grew into edible plants the next season. They experimented, perhaps planting near rivers where the soil was rich. Over generations, the knowledge deepened. Instead of wandering endlessly in search of food, people began to stay in one place, cultivating patches of land, shaping the wild into something more dependable. The effect on starvation was profound. Famine didn't vanish, crops failed, pests invaded, floods destroyed fields. But the cycle of feast and famine softened. People could store grain, dried beans, and preserved vegetables. Food became less about chance and more about planning. Suddenly, the desperate winters of old were not inevitable. Communities had insurance against hunger, something unheard of in the old cycle. Agriculture also changed the very shape of society. When food could be stored, people could support larger groups. Villages grew. Cooperation expanded. Instead of everyone spending every waking hour chasing calories, some could specialize in other things, making better tools, weaving clothes, telling stories, even arguing about who got the biggest share. Civilization was born out of full granaries. Of course, agriculture was no perfect solution. It brought back-breaking labor, long days in the fields, and the risk of dependence on a few crops. If a harvest failed, the famine could be just as devastating as any Ice Age winter. But compared to the endless uncertainty of wandering hunters, it was stability. And stability gave humanity the freedom to grow, literally and figuratively. Imagine the difference for a child born before and after agriculture. In the old days, they would grow up learning to dig roots, to follow herds, to endure weeks of hunger. After agriculture, they learned to plant, to harvest, to store grain in clay jars. Their winters might still be cold, but their bellies were more likely to be full. And with full bellies came more energy for culture, rituals, art, the beginnings of writing. The turning point of agriculture was not just about food, it was about hope. It was the moment humanity began to imagine that survival didn't always have to be a desperate scramble. That maybe the future could be planned, shaped, and secured. That the endless cycle of starvation might one day be broken. Tonight, as you lie in bed, you live in the world agriculture created. The food in your kitchen, the routines of your day, the very fact that you don't have to think constantly about what you'll eat tomorrow. All of it is rooted in that ancient turning point. And while famine hasn't disappeared from the world, the difference between now and then is vast. Agriculture was humanity's first great victory over the brutal winters that once ruled us. Memory is a funny thing. It doesn't always stay put in neat boxes of facts and dates. Sometimes it lingers as feelings, whispers, and instincts that we can't quite explain. The harsh winters of prehistory, the famines, the desperate choices people made, didn't just vanish when the snow melted and the seasons passed. They stayed. Not in writing. Prehistoric people didn't have books, but in the body, in the blood, in the stories that would outlast the people who first told them. Think about the instincts you carry even today. Why do so many of us feel a jolt of panic when food is scarce? Even if it's just the fridge looking a little emptier than usual. Why does wasting food feel almost sinful to some? Like throwing away something sacred. Those feelings are echoes. They come from ancestors who lived through times when every scrap mattered, when one wasted morsel could mean a child didn't live through the week. The panic you feel when you realize you forgot lunch at home isn't just modern irritability. It's the distant cry of survival logic that your ancestors hammered into your DNA. Stories, too, have carried those echoes. Myths of hunger, of man-eating monsters, of endless winters that swallowed the land whole. They're not just fanciful creations. They are memory, distorted and reshaped over centuries, but memory all the same. When people whispered about giants who devoured humans, or witches who lured children to eat them, they were remembering, in story form, the times when cannibalism happened for real. The ogre in the fairy tale is a cultural memory of the starving neighbor in the cave across the valley, the one who might have come knocking when the famine grew too harsh. Even religious traditions carry these traces. Think of rituals of fasting, of symbolic meals, of bread and wine shared to commemorate sacrifice. These aren't direct descents from Ice Age hunger, but the shape of them, the reverence for food, the deep connection between eating and spiritual meaning, are echoes of times when food itself was sacred, because it was life. To share food was to share survival. To hoard food was to risk exile. These instincts became wrapped up in morality, in myth, in cultural memory. And then there is the fear of the cold itself. Whole cultures developed myths about endless winters, about gods of frost and storms who threatened to wipe out life. In Norse mythology, there was the tale of Fimbulwinter, a terrible season of 3 unending winters with no summer between them, a time when humans would starve before the end of the world. Was this purely imagination? Or was it the long echo of prehistoric winters, remembered dimly but powerfully, and carried forward into story? The details may have changed, but the feeling of dread survived. You carry echoes in your body as well. Humans have certain adaptations that hint at the long battles with famine. The tendency to store fat, the craving for sugar and fat, the way your body resists, giving up its energy, reserves. All of these are survival traits, sculpted by millennia of feast and famine. Your DNA remembers the cycle, even when your mind doesn't. Every time you reach for comfort food in the cold months, that's not just habit. That's your body acting out the memory of ancestors who knew winter meant scarcity. And then there is the way humans remember, through community. Even when prehistoric people didn't have writing, they passed down stories of survival. Once, there was a winter when the food ran out, and the people ate bark from the trees. Or, once, there was a group who ate their dead and were cursed forever. These weren't just tales to scare children. They were cultural memory, encoded in narrative, warnings disguised as entertainment, survival lessons hidden in myth. Over generations, the details blurred, the lessons turned into monsters and curses, but the essence stayed. famine happens. Be ready. Don't forget. That's why we still tell stories of hunger and survival, even in a world where supermarkets overflow. Something in us insists that we remember, because forgetting would be dangerous. Forgetting would mean losing the lessons that kept our ancestors alive. And so, through stories, through instinct, through genetic adaptations, we carry the memory. Not always clearly, not always consciously, but deeply, in ways that shape us more than we realize. Even now, when you pull your blanket tighter on a cold night, when you feel gratitude for a hot meal, when you listen to stories that comfort you in the dark, you're participating in that ancient act of remembering. You're keeping alive the echoes of people who huddled around firelight, whispering tales into the long night, determined that the lessons of survival, however grim, would not be lost. And now, as the story slows, let's step away from the harsh winters, the cracked bones, the hunger that never seemed to end, and reflect on what it all means for you here, tonight. Because you are not in a cave, shivering under the hide of some animal, praying for dawn. You are in a warm bed. A blanket wraps around you. The air may be cool, but it is not a predator. You are safe. Take a moment to feel that safety. The hum of a heater or the stillness of the night replaces the howl of ice age winds. The softness of your pillow replaces the hard stone floors of a prehistoric shelter. Your stomach, full or at least not empty, is a comfort your ancestors could only dream of. What you have now is their triumph, the result of every desperate decision, every grim choice, every laugh in the dark. It is strange, isn't it, to think that you are here because people before you endured the unendurable. They survived winters that froze rivers solid, storms that buried forests, famines that lasted months. They survived hunger that made them chew bark, leather, and worse. They crossed lines they would never have imagined. Also, the fragile flame of life could continue. And that fragile flame has reached you, glowing gently, steady in the dark. So tonight, as you breathe slowly, as your eyelids grow heavy, think of yourself as part of that great story. You are the descendant of survivors. You carry their resilience in your bones, their memory in your instincts, their stubbornness in the way you keep going even on your hardest days. Every time you laugh in hardship, every time you share food, every time you endure, you are honoring them. Gratitude is a warm thing. Let it spread through you now, as steady as firelight in a cave. Gratitude for warmth, for shelter, for the luxury of listening to stories without fear. Gratitude for food waiting for you tomorrow, for people who love you, for the fact that survival no longer requires unthinkable choices. Gratitude because the story of hunger has become, for you, a story and not your reality. And as you sink deeper into rest, imagine the fire of your ancestors flickering beside you. Imagine their voices, telling stories into the night, comforting each other with myths, laughter, and dreams. Imagine the thread that runs from them to you, unbroken, steady, alive. You are part of that thread. You are the continuation of their triumph. The wind outside is only sound now, not threat. The dark is only quiet, not danger, and the hunger that haunted them is far away. You are safe, you are warm, and you can rest. Let the story fade. Let the firelight dim. Let your eyes close. You've carried their memory long enough for tonight. Now, let sleep carry you the rest of the way. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. You've traveled through the shadows of prehistory, and now it's time to rest. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let your body sink into the warmth of sleep. You've earned it. If you're still awake, gently drift over to one of the videos on your screen and keep the story going. And don't forget to subscribe, so you'll always have another tale waiting when the night feels long. Sleep well, dream warmly, and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.